Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest is Travis Christofferson, author of Tripping Over the Truth, the Metabolic Theory of Cancer. So Travis, thanks for coming. Really glad you're here.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, tell me, I found that people work in fields like this, unfortunately, usually because they've had some kind of personal experience with what they write about. I hope that's not the case, but what's your background? What got you into looking at, at cancer and metabolic therapy?
For me, it was just a genuine curiosity of the subject and just a true fascination with that there could be an alternative explanation for what the basic fundamental biology of cancer was. So it was kind of a collision of a school graduate research project and running into Tom Seyfried's book, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease, for that project is really what kicked it off for me. My undergrad was in pre-med, and so everything that I had learned prior to that was what was in textbooks, which was cancer is a genetic disease caused by key mutations to oncogenes, and then Tom's book, which is essentially a textbook, laid out this vast universe of data going back to the 20s, even before that, really, of all this compiled evidence that showed cancer could be perhaps a metabolic disease. And this converged right at the time, 2012, with the Cancer Genome Atlas project, where the technology had caught up and could really answer questions about what the genome of the cancer cell looked like. And the wake of that project created this sort of state of confusion that most people don't hear about because it's embedded deep in these biology journals. But people were trying to make sense of what the data was, what the cancer genome, what the mutations meant. And so it was perfect timing because that data was just coming out right while I dove into Tom's book, and that led to my book, which is kind of an examination of both sides of the coin.
So what, in your estimation, your experience, I know it's a huge question, but what causes cancer? The genetic theory, I guess, is, cells undergo mutations, either random or perhaps in response to stress, and, they become cancer cells. But what have you seen is actually what happens?
Every day I learn something new about this that kind of, you just sort of, add it to this kind of repository of knowledge, and you get this kind of image of what you think cancer is. But yeah, you're right. We used to think that it was just that clear cut, that we would find, if we could sequence a genome, and I say we, I just mean, the scientist community in general, if they could sequence the entire genome of cancer cells, they'd find this defining fingerprint of maybe, 4 to 10 mutations in oncogenes that was the cause of that type of cancer. And now we know it's not remotely that simple. There are cancers with 0 mutations that we find. There are cancers with 1 or 2 driving mutations. So it's a more complex picture than we thought. And what is the ultimate cause? In my mind, if you ask Tom Seyfried, he'll tell you it's mitochondrial damage, period. That's what kicks it off. But in my mind, that certainly could be a trigger. But what happens after that appears to be an epigenetic response. And when I say epigenetic, I just mean of the 22,000 genes we have in our genome, the epigenetics is the turning up and down of the volume control dials of each one of those genes. And so when you look at cancer cells, the pattern that's revealed is they are re-expressing this sort of cassette of embryonic genes. And so cancer looks like this sort of out of context rebooting of the program of embryogenesis. And so it's a program that's in every one of our cells, and it just sort of gets rebooted in this kind of out of context format. And interestingly, we find things every day. Like I just read this the other day, for example. You can take rats, which are social animals, and you can isolate them from birth and put them into cages where they're isolated, and then you have a control group that's living in a group. And the ones that are isolated have will develop up to 80 times more mammary tumors. So what's the answer that you get out of that is that our lifestyle, these factors, loneliness, even toxins we're exposed to, all these things sort of get distilled into this, really complex equation about whether we develop cancer or not.
So
that's a long answer.
So cancer is epigenetics. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but epigenetics is how cells express the genes that compose them.
Right.
So
exactly.
An epigenetic change means that, I guess, certain genes stop being expressed and other ones are expressed more or at all.
Exactly.
Is that
precisely?
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So like, for example, a neuron would never express a stomach acid gene, right? It gets shut off in the neuron. It gets turned on in the lining of the cells that line the stomach. And cancer, a good example is you're born with 4 versions of this gene called hexokinase. And hexokinase, those are called isozymes. There's 4 versions in your genome. Hexokinase catalyzes the first reaction in glycolysis, the first reaction of glucose as it goes down the glycolytic chain towards lactic acid or pyruvate, depending. But it's the first step in that process. There's 9 sort of chemical steps in that process. And when you're an embryo, you express the version called hexokinase 2. Then when you grow up as an adult, you'll switch to expressing primarily hexokinase 1. But the cancer cell will revert back to hexokinase 2. And hexokinase 2 is essentially the enzyme that's responsible for what we call the Warburg effect. It doesn't have a break on it. The enzyme is not subject to what we call product inhibition. It just rips through the glycolytic pathway and shoves glucose down it. So it's a single conversion, from one enzyme to another that's within our genome that's responsible for this hallmark feature of cancer. So that's one example.
What do you mean when you say it changes how glucose is processed?
Well, okay, so a cancer cell, if you talk to Tom Seyfried, I'm sure you heard a lot about this. Cancer cells, one of the hallmark features is they exhibit what we call the Warburg effect. And you can, debate why they're doing this, but the Warburg effect essentially is that cancer will primarily use glucose as a fuel, and it runs through glycolysis, and that creates energy, and then it kicks out lactic acid, which is a waste product. And the question is why would cancer cells be doing that? They do this in the presence of oxygen. Most healthy cells in the presence of oxygen will use what we call aerobic metabolism. So they'll go through glycolysis, and then the glucose will enter the mitochondria and make energy with oxygen. But cancer cells sort of bypass that second step and just kick out lactic acid. And the question is, why are they doing that? And that's been debated. It's still being debated today.
So Thomas Seyfried said that cancer cells use glucose, but they also use glutamine. I don't know if you found that to be true or not, or if it's primarily just glucose as their fuel source.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. There's 2 fuels they prefer to use, glucose and glutamine, and they're somewhere on the spectrum. Some cancers like glucose more than glutamine, and vice versa. Some cancer cells like, the inverse, glutamine more than glucose. But yeah, those are the 2 primary fuels.
Okay. So in response to stresses, I guess diet, environment, toxins, loneliness, etc., people's bodies, I guess, what is the mechanism that causes them to have cancer cells or to create cancer cells?
Well, so that if we could answer that, we'd know the prime origin, and I just think it's a series of extraordinarily complex events. But whatever kicks it off, we know that those are variables. We know obviously cigarette smoke is a huge variable. So it's these damaging events. Something like loneliness, for example. Well, you can measure the effect in people. They produce more cortisol, which is an epigenetic acting sort of like hormone. It goes in, attaches to DNA, and changes the way genes are expressed. And so over time, over time, as you produce too much cortisol, it changes the way your immune system responds. It has more of an inflammatory response, less targeted. So that may allow an environment where cancer cells can, sort of escape the immune system. But to pin it down to a certain series of events, I think is almost impossible. It's just this myriad of complexity.
And then, all right. So, what about the therapy side? You said already. You gave some hints. That cancer cells use glucose differently from regular cells. They also use glutamine. So, what have you realized through your research? What kind of therapies could target cancers? Beyond normal radiation and chemotherapy, et cetera, or
Yeah.
instead of perhaps.
Yeah, I get, the low-hanging fruit to that, sort of this cancer therapy, what we've noticed metabolically is it seems like metabolic therapies are very good adjuvants, meaning they kind of set the cancer cell up to die easier. So if you come in with something like radiation or a cytotoxic chemotherapy, they die quicker and they die a more orderly, less inflammatory death. And they do this beautifully. They sort of differentiate between normal cells and cancer cells. Like, for example, the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet will restrict glucose, and when you do that to healthy cells, your liver will start producing ketone bodies, and healthy cells will start burning ketone bodies. And when they do that, they upregulate what we call glutathione. So it's this intercellular antioxidant. And conversely, cancer cells, obviously they love glucose and they can't respond as well to ketones, so they have less glutathione. So you've set up this sort of therapeutical differential between a healthy cell and a normal cell, where the healthy cells have more energy and they have more intercellular antioxidants, and the cancer cells have less energy and less antioxidants. And so then when you come in with something like radiation, for example, and this is very measurable, you come in with chemotherapy or radiation, the healthy cells are protected and there's fewer side effects. So if somebody comes into chemotherapy in a fasted state, you can measure, the number of mouse sores, the number of times that they vomit, or things like that, and they're incredibly reduced. The number of times vomited, this was a study done on, I think, 15 patients, was reduced from like 6 a day to 0.
Wow.
So every side effect is diminished, and then you get this more robust response. The cancer cells are dying easier and quicker and more en masse because they can't defend themselves. So you get, this beautiful therapeutic differential, and that's just done by diet or fasting. But we're learning, as far as therapies go, there's a whole range of things that we can use that act metabolically. You're learning about repurposed drugs. Old drugs like Metformin that are originally prescribed for type 2 diabetes have a very robust anti-cancer effect as an adjuvant, meaning they set the cells up again and to die easier. Exogenous ketones. There's a whole list of things. Yeah.
This is great. Yeah, I'd like to ask you about all these in brief. So, fasting, just a quick question about the protocol. What would be ideal? Let's say I'm going to have chemo. I should fast beforehand. Should I fast after the chemo for a certain period of time? Like, again, I know it's different for everybody and it varies and all that, but what's a general idea of what would be helpful to a chemo treatment to make it a lot more effective, or a radiation treatment?
Yeah, we don't have a great answer to that. The study that was done, the guy that did it is Walter Longo at UCLA. He had a hard time convincing oncologists to participate in the study. They didn't want to do it. But he finally convinced a number of them to do it. And I think the patients, they fast depending on how their ability to fast. Some patients are very, they're sick and they can't do a prolonged fast. So that study, it varied from 24 hours to 72 hours. He tried to get them out to do a fast for 72 hours before, but some of the patients could only do 24 to 48. So we don't, we don't have like a dose response curve to what would work best. I think the answer is just how well you can tolerate it. Your state of health. If you're feeling good, you could go to 72 hours beforehand. But yeah.
What about after? Let's say I do 24 and then I have it. Should I wait another 24 to eat, or I just eat right after and it's had the effect? Or what's your guess?
Yeah, no, I don't know the answer to that. I think, afterwards you're trying to set that sort of differential I talked about up before you get the chemotherapy or the radiation. So I guess the answer, we don't know what the effect would be afterwards. Yeah.
I guess it sounds like that study needs to be done. That would be very helpful and shed a lot of light, right?
Yeah. The problem with those kind of studies is money. The biggest problem is those therapies are free, so no one really, there's very little funding to do them.
No, they literally are, because you're not eating. Same for exogenous ketones. So would it be helpful for someone to maybe fast and take exogenous ketones before a therapy like that?
The preclinical data says yes. There's a good study done by Dominic D'Agostino and Tom Seyfried where they, I think it was a glioma model with mice, where they tested mice on a ketogenic diet And again, when you say ketogenic diet, essentially it's just the nutritional maintenance of the fasting state. So you expect to see sort of a similar result. And these mice were on a ketogenic diet. They measured their overall survival. They measured it. Then the ketogenic diet combined with hyperbaric oxygen. And then the third arm of the study was a ketogenic diet combined with hyperbaric oxygen combined with exogenous ketones. And the mice in the ketogenic diet lived a little longer than the control group. The mice with the ketogenic diet with HBOT lived a little longer, even more, a little longer than the ketogenic diet mice. And then the third arm, when they added in the exogenous ketones, those mice lived the longest. So that we have that evidence. We have the evidence that when you just do a simple petri dish experiment and you add ketones in, you keep glucose levels the same, and you add ketones in, cancer cells seem to sputter and have trouble, even just adding those in. And there's other reasons for that. We think that they probably act as a drug in themselves beyond just being a fuel replacement. They have the sort of epigenetic acting quality to them that may have an anti-cancer effect by itself.
Sure. Okay. And then you talked about bringing back old drugs like metformin. Metformin, what it suppresses glucose, or what does it do, and why does it affect people with cancer, you think?
Well, metformin is a weird drug. So it's originally a natural product isolated from the French lilac plant. It's been around since the 50s. Remarkable drug for type 2 diabetes. And the interesting thing about drugs like that, when they get so well prescribed, I think it's the second most widely prescribed drug in the world right now, is you get this huge experimental block of data. You have people on this drug, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on this drug for decades. And so you can follow them. It's an epidemiological dream scenario. And when you follow people on metformin, you get this weird scenario starts to emerge where people with type 2 diabetes it looks like even more protected from cancer than the general population. So then you circle back and ask, why is this drug doing this? It's conferring some sort of, preventative effect for cancer than healthy people not on metformin. And it just does a lot of strange things. Yeah, it lowers blood glucose. That's one thing. It does that very well. But it also messes with what we call the electron transport chain. It inhibits one of the protein complexes, which sounds terrible. But the side effect of that is for some reason some sort of protective quality in the cell. And when you look at cancer, what you realize, we've underappreciated the fact that they're really vulnerable to oxidative stress. And that's why, like we talked about the ketogenic diet, reducing their amount of antioxidants, that appears to be one of the best ways to kill cancer cells, is either give them overloads of oxidative stress, and that just means free radicals. We can do that through hyperbaric oxygen. It's a very gentle way to do it. Or we can reduce their ability to make antioxidants. But metformin seems to mess with the electron transport chain in a way that causes them to have just an intolerable amount of free radicals, and they just die sooner or die easier. So that's one of the mechanisms of action. And again, in healthy cells, it appears to be what we call a hormetic response. And that's when you stress cells just the right way. This is kind of why fasting works. When you provide a biological stressor in the right way, you get a sort of a healthy response. So that's no one really knows how metformin works. That's still being debated.
So have you seen people that have had cancer that have tried the whole gamut? They're taking metformin, they're doing hyperbaric oxygen, they're taking exogenous ketones, they're fasting, they're doing everything. Is there any creatures out there, people that have done that? What's happened?
Yeah, we're starting to see more and more people do that. These are all kind of N of 1 stuff, but
right.
Yeah, I'm involved with an organization called Care Oncology, and they got started in the UK, and they prescribe this combination of repurposed drugs as an adjuvant therapy while they're running a clinical trial. And we've helped bring this over to the US, and so we see patients, that are doing all sorts of combinations of therapies, ketogenic diets, the Care Oncology protocol and things like that. And, statistical data is obviously what you have to rely on, but we are seeing patients that are, defying odds with very, very serious terminal cancers that are far out. So it's too early to say, but yeah, you're on the exact right track. If we're ever going to beat this disease, it's going to be through a combination many different therapies, different dosage, different timing, but it's going to be through that sort of approach.
Okay. So what right now are you, today, what are you working on? What are you researching, and what do you hope the results will be in the near future?
Well, we're doing, what we're doing with Care Oncology is it's just an interesting model because it's essentially using these repurposed drugs. There's a huge repository of data that gives you the confidence to treat patients off-label. And so that's what they did in the UK, was come up with a combination, that synergistically these drugs work together. And the data clearly shows that in combination, they're much more powerful than by themselves. And so you have the evidence to treat patients. These drugs, one of them is Metformin. They've been around forever. We know everything about them, pharmacokinetics, dynamics, everything, their safety profile. So you can do this very safely. And then you just track outcomes over time. So you can measure the effect as an adjunctive therapy over time. So it's a model where, you're not saying, okay, let's test this in a clinical trial setting. It's there's enough evidence to treat, but then let's also circle back and measure these outcomes. So that's what I'm involved with here in the U.S. And it's a very interesting model. And, we hope to expand off that. We'll get the data for these 4 drugs, and then we'll be able to, do a version 2.0, the next, combination that we think is going to have the best effect.
Are there particular cancers that you want to go after versus others, or particular circumstances?
Well, we want to go after them all. And the data clearly shows that. The metformin, when you look at people, almost every cancer that they've ever looked at with metformin, it's had an effect. And that, not saying every study's shown an effect, but when they do show an effect, it's in a variety of cancers. And then you ask why, and because it circles back to this: you're targeting this ubiquitous sort of defect in the cancer cell, this metabolic change that is across the.
Okay. Yeah, from what I've seen, usually the people that work with cancer, they have I don't know, I'm not going to call it their favorites, but ones that they consider to be more serious. So they want to target those particular cancers, or there's certain cancers that have unusual characteristics that they want to target. You mentioned at the very beginning of the interview, which I didn't know this, that some cancers genetically they look the exact same as regular cells, and some of them do have altered genes.
Pediatric cancers, for example, they have 0 mutations. So we don't have to. That's a good thing about these metabolic therapies, is we don't have to worry about the mutational profile for the most part. Where as if you're using a targeted drug, that limits you to the type of cancer and then the type of mutations that are in that cancer in most cases.
Are there any particular cancers you've seen that are the most susceptible to the type of therapies we've been talking about? The easiest, the lowest hanging fruit to knock out.
Yeah,
which ones are the tougher ones?
The glioblastoma is one of the worst types of cancer there is. It's the brain cancer that John McCain just took John McCain. It seems to be on the rise. It's one of the most aggressive cancers there is. That one, brain cancers in general seem to be very susceptible to these type of therapies, because the brain, the neurons are sort of a hybrid where they like to burn glucose if glucose is available, but they can easily switch to ketones. So they're as far as metabolic therapies go, they seem to be very responsive to that. So, and that was our first data, UK, that was their first data with Care Oncology, was in glioblastoma. And it was a 100-patient cohort. And when you add those 4 drugs to standard of care, you see about a doubling in overall survival.
Oh, wow.
And we'll see, as time goes on, ketogenic diets, what their role as an adjuvant will be with glioblastomas. But it'll be interesting to see when you add that in and a few other things, what that survival curve looks like.
So, you said you learn stuff every day, which is really great. What surprises you about cancer and about the therapies? Like, maybe it's a particular cancer where you just can't believe it acts that way. Again, what are some things that, the normal public, or maybe probably most doctors don't even know, that you've seen that are just very unusual?
Man, that's a tough question.
Interesting to you, or exciting because it shows a way to fight cancer that, maybe wasn't seen before? Anything that really piques your interest in what you're doing?
Yeah. It's funny because these things, seem so simple and they're free, but they have such a difficult time getting up and running. I guess the ketogenic diet, it's being studied now. There's probably a dozen clinical trials across the U.S. But what's kind of surprising to me is how difficult it's been. The oncologists will sort of draw a line, and of course, this doesn't mean every oncologist, and I think this comes from just the nature of their job. But they draw a line between standard of care and then everything else. And the surprising thing to me is when there's so much literature, so much data, that there has to be that delineation between standard of care and nothing else. Doctors, especially with patients like glioblastoma, they just need to take more chances. The patients want it. They can do the math on a terminal illness. They can measure risk and reward, where oncologists will say, no, I don't, there's no reason to try that. You can ask an oncologist about aspirin, say, no, there's a risk of bleeding. Well, my median overall survival is 11 or 14 months. I'm not worried about a 2% chance of a minor bleed. So that's what surprises me, is this is kind of, and I think, in defense of oncologists, their job is brutally difficult. And patients come to them with a variety of questions all the time. This is probably no excuse, but I think they just get burned out. And they draw that line between standard of care and not wanting to try other things in certain cases. But I guess that's what surprises me the most, is that unwillingness to take risk, but do it in a responsible way. We can always measure outcomes. We have electronic medical records. Every patient can be a data point. So when we do take risks and try new things, that data can be collected. We could do so much better in oncology.
So, well, perhaps doctors are worried about not providing the standard of care because they would get in trouble, right? If they didn't.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a gun to their head, right?
Absolutely. Yep. That's the other part, is the legal issues. I mean, they do have to do standard of care, and you're not even in most cases asking them to forego standard of care. What you're just asking is additional things on top of standard of care that might help, that might make it work better. And those fall under the label or under what we call off-label use. And you look around and you'll see academic institutions are more willing to do off-label stuff, especially in very dire cases, than of course like a community hospital where they're just not going to try anything else. But and even going off-label carries risk, because if something goes wrong, they can be held responsible. But I think that's extremely rare. I think patients, that's what they want if they have a very dire prognosis, and it's very rare for the doctors to get in trouble for doing that.
Well, we can't even call this advice, but people that are listening, there may be some, unfortunately, that are dealing with cancer. Maybe they have a dire diagnosis. I don't know. I know you can't advise them, but what can you say? What could they do? What should they do to at least get informed? What resources can you talk about? Or, if they have a doctor and they want to try certain things, what's your advice for them without advising them?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess to not advise them, I'd not advise them to get as much information as you possibly can. That's the first step. And then the hard part is, well, what information is good and what isn't. But I would ask your GP, it doesn't just have to be your oncologist. You can take it to other MDs, or if you have doctor friends or people that are maybe more versed, in healthcare. Because there's a lot of simple things out there. Like we said, there's good evidence that fasting before the chemo is going to help, and that's safe and easy. I don't think anybody's going to, you're not really going out on a limb there to do that. A ketogenic diet, that's just, different in macronutrient ratios. So just those simple things that are safe, those are right there in front of you. There's not clinical trial evidence to point to. There is a clinical trial to show that ketogenic diet is safe, a phase 1 trial. But there's a lot of good theory and preclinical work to say, suggest that it can help. Again, repurposed drugs, there's a mountain of data about certain drugs, and it's not just the care oncology drugs. There's about 80 or so, there's about 6,000 drugs out there that can be prescribed in the whole pharmacopoeia. And you whittle that down to about 80 of those have good anti-cancer activity. And we know, again, because they're old drugs, we know their safety profile. We know when there's adverse events or they're not, they contradict with certain chemotherapies, so that there's that out there. And there's organizations that are looking at those all the time. And there's groups, patient advocacy groups that are comparing notes on those all the time. So those are things you can take to your doctor and ask, if they can potentially help. So those are very safe things that are right there in front of everybody. And they can hit the literature and do on their own.
Is there such a thing called a metabolic therapy doctor?
No, not yet, but there will be someday. I'm sure of it. There's I guess there's just doctors that are more interested in it. I know some oncologists that are just interested in that lifestyle. They've adopted a ketogenic diet for different reasons, and that kind of got them interested in that and the metabolism, and then it circled back to their oncology careers, and they discovered this whole new realm of metabolic oncology, and they advise their patients on ketogenic diets and things like that. So I think it's just a matter of merging those two interests and disciplines over time. That will be a subcategory eventually.
Yeah, it's one of the problems I've realized is if you have cancer, obviously you're very afraid, and that's preys upon your mind constantly. And the doctor tells you one thing, and then if you look and you try to research other stuff, you just don't know if it'll be effective or not, and you're faced with like a serious dilemma because your life's at stake. So it makes it really hard to think clearly and to say, well, can I try this and will it affect that? Should I keep going to my normal doctor and doing my normal standard of care stuff and try this other stuff or not? I don't want to die. What should I do? It seems like it's a really, really tricky thing. It makes it very difficult for people to know what to do.
Extraordinarily tricky. And I think you're right. When you have a diagnosis like that, you look at the person in front of you and you want them to, you hope that they're going to have all the answers. You don't want it to be that hard. Unfortunately, they're just a human being. And what happened with medicine is, medicine used to be easy. There was a handful of therapies that worked back in the 1800s, and a doctor was a doctor. We've nurtured this culture of autonomy, of self-sufficiency. We put doctors on the sort of omniscient pedestal, but the problem is medicine has just outstripped the capacity of the human mind to do it effectively. There is too much to know, and a recent Mayo Clinic study showed that 88% of the time, if you get a second opinion, it'll change the treatment pathway. So even within one diagnosis, you will get conflicting opinions. The variation in healthcare in our hodgepodge medical system is crazy. You will get, in Davenport, Iowa, you'll get a stent put in, or if you go to Stanford, you won't. So you have to sort of, right away just acknowledge how complex this is, and that one person is probably not going to have all the answers. That doesn't mean you don't listen to them. The oncologists, there's very good data for standard of care, but there's nothing wrong with seeking out second opinions and other advice from other professionals.
Okay. So just to conclude, what are some resources people can read or find out or look at, to help inform them better about the whole, about cancer in general, or about their condition if they have one?
Oh, if you're really interested in it, I love Tom Seyfried's book, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease. It's really heavy textbook wise. Dietary stuff, I love the book by Miriam Kamari, Keto for Cancer. That's a wonderful book. It's really hard to give one summary, but there's a lot of stuff cropping up right now as far as metabolic stuff for cancer. So I think that if you get savvy with PubMed, that can lead you down rabbit holes, and you'll find a ton of information on you'll start to find some certain researchers that are really doing this stuff and kind of read their studies. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you.
Well, how about this guy Travis Christofferson that wrote Tripping Over the Truth?
I didn't want to plug my own book, but yeah, that's a good place to start too.
Right, that's great. Well, Travis, thanks for coming. I really appreciate your time and your insights. And I don't know if you want to give away for listeners to get in touch if they have questions, or just your book is good.
Yeah, book is good. I would just steer them to the book. Yep.
Okay. Well, very good. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
You bet, Richard. Thank you. Take care.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner of Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.